About 5.02 today. All right, so I think this one is called evolutionary relationships. All right. All right. So, so this one is asking, so what similarities do you see between the gray wolves over here and these, domesticated dogs over here? Like, what do you see?
Uh, their mouths,
Mm-hmm.
their ears,
Mm-hmm.
very similar.
Right.
They both have 4 limbs and fur.
Okay, very good. Right. So they look pretty similar, right? So the
Yes.
idea is that both of these descended from a common ancestor. So the idea is that so maybe like so throughout throughout history, right? Like people have especially when people used to be hunters and gatherers and used to live in um, you know used to travel from place to place and do a lot more hunting. That was like required rather than just farming. You know, so like maybe some kind of wolf or dog-like creature was often like something beneficial, right? Because so if you had some kind of creature like this that was tame, right? Like why could that be a benefit for a human being? Like what did people use dogs for, or wolves or dogs or whatever for? Hmm? Anas, what do you think?
Hmm. How was?
So people use them for like hunting, right?
Yeah.
Right. So people, if someone, wanted to go hunting, often, having a fast creature like this would be beneficial. Maybe it would be beneficial for protection, right? For like a guard dog
Yes.
or something, right? If you had, these kinds of creatures hanging around the camp, maybe, and they were, relatively friendly, then maybe, other kinds of creatures would not, show up, to bother you, right? So there's different kinds of reasons why people think that people started to, keep, wolves and those kinds of things, around the camp, around their settlements, and so there's other kinds of animals that also had beneficial effects, like cats, right? Why do you think people kept cats in their houses?
Because they kind of like clean, like there's not gonna be like any rats and
Hmm.
rodents.
Right. So especially when you want to like store grain and store food, right? You want something to keep away the mice and the rats and those kinds of things. Right. So different kinds of reasons why people, domesticated different kinds of animals. So the idea is that this wolf over time, or maybe something that looks similar to this kind of wolf, um, was slowly changed through artificial selection, through like artificial breeding, artificial selection, into something that looks similar to the, something on the right. Right. So we're going to talk about some of those kinds of principles, that they're going to present today. So this just over here, just kind of showing you, something similar. So there are wolves like all over the place, right? They're not wolves in just one location. There were wolves in many different, parts of the world, and there's different kinds of wolves, right? So if you look at, the domestic, dog breeds in different areas around the world, they all look a little bit different. So it's not really clear whether all of these dogs came about kind of separately, or whether they all came from like one set of animals, right? So it could be different groups of people, try to sort of domesticate and change wolves over time, or maybe they came all from the same common ancestor. But in any case, it's just showing all the different kinds of breeds of dog that have been artificially selected for over time. So this idea of evolution was first introduced by this person, Charles Darwin. So he was going on a voyage all over the world. So usually like when there was like a navy. So most of these scientists, they were on ships that that were that belonged to the Navy. So, like for example, this ship over here, went all over the world, and different ships, left, Great Britain for many different reasons, and other countries. Sometimes for military purposes, sometimes just for exploration, sometimes to find like new trade routes, all different kinds of things, right? So they often took like maybe some kind of scientist along with them who was interested in studying different kinds of things, right? Because they could take this person all over the world, and this person would go around and collect specimens and this kind of thing. So this person, Charles Darwin, he was one of the scientists. He was a scientist on this ship, and they went all over the place. So he's primarily known for his trip to the Galapagos Islands, which is off the coast of South America over here. So he was here in South America on these islands, and that's where he came up with some of these different ideas. So first of all, he noticed a couple different things. So he noticed that there were a lot of different kinds of species all over the world, and there were he noticed, for example, that there were different kinds of flightless birds that lived in different places around the world. So they weren't like the same flightless bird, right? They were all different types of flightless birds. So he thought that these different kinds of birds all came they were not like the same species. They were not like similar types. They all came about separately. So something in the environment caused some previous bird ancestor to change into a flightless bird many different times over. Right? Does that make sense? Like, it's not that one bird became a flightless bird and then from there they became this thing, the rhea in South America, the ostrich, and the emu. Is that three separate times birds became flightless. Does that make sense, the difference between those two? Anas.
Yes.
All right, so does the difference between those two scenarios make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So you notice that species all over the world, were very different, that it wasn't the same species that were repeated over and over. So what could this imply? This could imply that these species they evolved separately in their own geographical location. All right. In addition, he noticed that species vary locally. So, for example, on this island, he found many different species of, finch, which is a kind of bird. And so these finches, right? They were all, were similar, more similar to each other than they were to birds in other places, right? So he thought, okay, that means that, for some reason these birds are more closely related. However, they're not the same species. They're all different species, right? And they all have different kinds of beaks to do different kinds of things. Some of these beaks are good for, looking for insects. Others are good for crushing seeds and those kinds of things. So this is these are the islands right here off the coast of Ecuador. This is Ecuador in South America. And so on these islands, right, on each of these islands, there are different species of finches. And many of the different species are different when it comes to their beaks, when it comes to different characteristics they had. But primarily, what's easy to study on a bird is its beak. So he found that there are all different kinds of beaks of, on these finches, right? So some of them over here on the right are good at crushing seeds. Others are probing beaks, maybe to, go into a tree and probe for different kinds of insects. Over here are grasping beaks. That can be useful for different things. A lot of finches, they also use tools, right, to go get insects and to go poke around in trees and find out what's there, right? So different kinds of things. These are fruit eaters, right? So this bird is good for tearing apart fruit. So all of these are more similar to each other than to finches, in other parts of the world. Right? However, they still all have different types of beaks. Right? So what did he assume, from that these finches, came from a common ancestor, that there was some common ancestor from South America, and then over time, they all, this bird over here.
Like they scattered around and they had to like get used to the habitat.
Mhm. Right. So this one bird, flew all over the place, and over time, slowly changed into different forms based on what the environment was, based on what the food sources were, and those kinds of things. So apart from noticing that, like for example, that there's different species, slightly different species in the same area, you notice that there were slightly different species throughout time as well. So this right over here is a picture of some kind of giant armadillo. They call it this glyptodont, right? So obviously armadillos today, they don't really look like this. I don't know that there's any species of armadillo that's this big, right? So there's this giant armadillo, and it looks similar to the smaller armadillo that we see today, right? Like there's some armadillos here, for example, right? But this giant armadillo looks similar to the smaller armadillo and kind of lived in the same kind of area, in the same region. So if you look at the area where an armadillo, where like a regular armadillo, lives today, and you go down into the fossil record in that same area, you'll find species from this, larger giant armadillo. So what did he assume from that? He assumed that this giant armadillo slowly over time changed to become a small armadillo. So all of these things that we talked about before, these are ideas about natural selection, right?
Yes.
Right. So natural selection means that without the influence of like a human being, right? Without the influence of someone who's like picking and choosing different things that are useful for a human being, right? There's also artificial selection. So artificial selection means that a human being decided, hey, I'm going to take this species of plant or animal, and I'm going to, cross-pollinate it, or
change its genes and
yes,
like how it grows.
right. So to change it for human purposes, right? So right here they're talking mostly about plants. That's like some of the most like domesticated plants, farm animals. These are the most obvious types of examples, right? So notice
Yes.
all these different vegetables, right? So based on the genetic analysis, the idea is that all of these vegetables were bred from this plant right over here. It's called the wild mustard, right? So it's also called Brassica oleracea.
Oleracea.
Yeah, oleracea or something like that. So all of these different, plants that you see at the supermarket, right, at the grocery store, they all came from this wild mustard. So for example, the broccoli, cauliflower, right, those obviously like seem a little bit related, but cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, all these different kinds of things, all were selected from this plant. So, for example, this plant over here, maybe someone found, that some people in the past used to eat its leaves, right? And they decided that, look, we want to have a plant that has larger leaves. So they would select for that. And slowly over time, more and more of this plant will be covered in leaves, right? And then, some other people decided, hey, we're going to select for the stem. We're going to have, we want to chop up and eat the stem. So they selected for that characteristic, and eventually turned into this vegetable, and so on, right? So this is one example of artificial selection. This is another example, right? On the left is more natural selection, right? Like no human being tried to, change or breed, giraffes, for example, right?
Yes.
But on the right, they believe that the corn, like the corn plant that you see with all these kernels, came from this wild plant that's called teosinte. And so this has like has all these like, bunches of tiny seeds. So people start eating them. And then, over time, they started to breed them to where it became a modern corn like this. So this happened here in North America. I think probably in Mexico, in like kind of like the Mexico area, or maybe southwestern United States area, somewhere over in that area. That's where this process took place. Right. And this is just like another example. They're talking about dog breeds descended from wolves or other wild dogs. Right. Right. All right. So how does this process occur? Right. So we're going to look a little bit more in detail to some of the principles about how this occurs. Right. So we know that, like, for example, this over here can be selectively bred into this. Right. But how exactly do these kinds of things occur? What is the theory about how these things occur? So the first principle is that populations evolve, not individuals, right? So what does it mean that populations evolve? It means that over time, their DNA, overall, what is the DNA of a population? What are the different genes that exist in a population? Over time change, right? So an individual, during their own lifetime, does their DNA change? No, right? The DNA down in the cell, in the nucleus, right, does not change in an individual, right? Unless there's like some kind of a like cancer mutation or something random like that.
Yeah.
But basically, an individual's DNA is basically pretty much fixed for their whole life, right?
Yeah.
So individuals do not change over time. It's the population that changes, right? So overall, what is the so among a population, right? There's a variety of different genes and percentages of genes that are present. So for example, there's blood type, right? Have you heard of like different blood types that people have? Anas, have you heard of like different blood types that people have?
What? I can't really hear you. Let me increase my PC volume. Like my mom's speaking too. And yeah.
So so people have different blood types, right? What
Yes.
are some different blood types that you have heard about?
Like O positive, O negative, A positive, A negative, B
Right.
positive, B negative.
Right. So you would say that, for example, like maybe like, let's say 15% of the population is O, 20% is A, 25% is B, AB, whatever it is, right? There's a certain distribution of the population that has certain characteristics. So each individual, like a person who has, type O, is not going to turn into type A or type AB or something like that, right?
Yes.
However, if you look at the population level, the percentages in the population can change. For example, over time, maybe the percentage of people who have type O increases, right?
Yes.
So, like for example, let's suppose type O is really advantageous, right? So people with other blood types, let's say, start dying off, right? They don't survive, and let's say only the people who, have blood type O, they survive, right? So then over time, obviously, like more and more people, if they reproduce, more and more people in the population are going
Would
to
have O type.
have O type, right? So that's the idea here. The populations evolve, not each individual. You're looking at, the change occurs at the level of the entire population, right?
Yeah.
So next, variations occur naturally within populations. So variation means different things, right? Different characteristics. So just like there's different types of blood, right? When it comes to color, comes to strength, comes to maybe at the microscopic level, different kinds of enzymes, all different kinds. When it comes to anything, there's different variations within populations. There's all within grasshoppers, there are slight differences among all, the different types of grasshoppers, right? So naturally there's variations. So why is that important? Because that means that when the environment changes, some of them are going to be slightly better for the new environment compared to the other variations, right? So let's suppose all four of there's four, let's suppose in this species of grasshoppers, there's four different color types, right? They're all slightly different colors, right? So let's suppose that this one on the bottom right is, is like the most camouflaged, right? The other ones, they kind of stick out more and the predators start to eat these away. Over time, a higher and higher percentage of the population is going to look like this one on the bottom right, right? So before you have like selection, before the population changes, there must be some differences among the individuals in the population. Otherwise, there's nothing to select for, right?
Yes.
But if there are differences, then the environment can select, hey, I'm going to choose this one over that one. And then over time, the population goes towards that variation and away from some other variation. Right?
Okay.
Now, another thing is that all species have the capacity to overproduce. So especially when it comes to these small creatures, they produce a lot of eggs or a lot of children. And so why do you think that's important, or like why do you think that's relevant here? Why is it relevant that this grasshopper is going to overproduce? Overproduce means that
It's because that's like the only species which can like actually like live at that one spot.
kind of, it could be. So the reason is so this grasshopper, for example, right, overproduces. What does overproduce mean? It means that this
Like they produce like way too much, and there's way too much of the same population
right. So they produce
of the same species.
yeah. So they produce a lot more children than children that survive until like adulthood and reproduce themselves. So if this grasshopper produces like these 20 or whatever grasshoppers, let's say only like 5 of them are going to actually survive to adulthood, right? So that's what overproduction means. So why is that like relevant? So let's suppose there's slight difference. So if this grasshopper has all of these children, they're not all the same, right? Each one is going to be slightly different in their DNA, some different variation.
Yeah.
Right? And so therefore that gives you a whole bunch of different, different types of DNA that you can select from, right? If you just had like a few, well, then there's not going to be much variation. There's not going to be much to select from. But here you have like a whole bunch of different, grasshoppers. They produce a whole lot, and thus, some will, some will survive, and so those who survive will be better adapted to the environment than the ones who died off, on average. Right. So over time, once a population changes towards something, right, that change is called an adaptation, right? Let's suppose there's different, colors of the grasshopper, right? And over time, slowly, more and more, a higher and higher percentage of the grasshoppers become green because they live in a very green environment, and that's the best camouflage. Well, you would say the color green is an adaptation, right? And this is just giving examples of different adaptation, right? It could the adaptations could be physical, right? It could be just what it looks like on the outside, right? It could be physiological, right? Things that you don't see, but have to do with all the way down at the chemical level, at the molecular level, right? Like maybe during photosynthesis, one plant has like some enzyme or some chemical that works like a little bit better and more efficiently.
Or the like cell structure type.
Right, the cell structure. Maybe there's some animal produces a protein that's slightly better for something, right? So that's not something you can see, right? That's not physical appearance, but that's in the physiological function, that is an adaptation. There's also adaptations that are behavioral, right? So behavioral adaptations are things like intelligence, hunting techniques, methods for searching for food, stuff like that. So for example, some birds, right, they use tools to go poke around into trees and they bring out insects. So that's a behavioral method, that's a behavioral adaptation that bird could have developed. Right? So this is just saying that, look, over time, whatever is a beneficial adaptation, whether it's color or behavior, over time, you're gonna have a higher and higher percentage of the population exhibiting that adaptation. So Darwin's idea was that over time, if you build up all of these adaptations, one adaptation at a time, eventually you build up so many different adaptations that the creature becomes an entirely different species. That's the idea.
Like penguins.
Yeah, you could say like penguins. So there's there's different kinds of penguins, right? So one species of penguin could have, if you add up all of the, small adaptations, over time it's gonna, instead of looking like its original penguin, it's gonna start to look like a completely different new penguin, and then we're gonna call it a different species. So that's what this is saying.
If it was possible for people to like look for fossils in the Antarctic, we would probably find like different types of species other than like penguins and polar bears.
Right, you're talking.
Especially, we can also like get probably their whole body because it's really cold there and they'll probably like freeze.
Right. All right, so let's talk about, so this is artificial versus natural selection, right? So we talked a little bit about it before. So what is artificial selection? It's when humans decide what traits are beneficial. So humans are selecting for something in an animal or a plant, right?
Yes.
Natural selection is without human intervention, right? So what are some this one is talking about extinction, right? So this picture over here is showing, many extinct animals of North America, right? So especially here in North America during like the Ice Age and that kind of thing, there were a lot of creatures that were a lot bigger than the creatures of today. So for example, there used to be, things like woolly mammoths, Columbia mammoths, bison that were a lot bigger than bison of today. There was a giant sloth. There were the bears and wolves were larger than the bears and wolves that live in North America today, right? So anyways, a lot of these creatures, they went extinct because they believe the environment changed over time. So during the Ice Age, these creatures may have adapted well, but as the environment started to change and started to warm up, then they believe that a lot of these creatures could have died off because of that changing environment. So they're not sure why all these creatures necessarily died off. It could be because of the changing environment, could be because of hunting, but whatever it is, a lot of creatures, they went extinct. So this paragraph is just saying that as the environment changes, let's suppose a place used to be a desert or used to have a lot of trees, but over time it starts to become a desert. Well, obviously the old animals, they cannot they either have to adapt or they will go extinct. Right? And they're just giving some examples here about how different environments lead to different adaptations, being developed. So rat snakes, for example, right? There are different colors of rat snakes, right? So they're giving different examples. There are black rat snakes like this one here. They're yellow striped, orange, and green. So these different snakes, they will survive in different to different levels based on the color of the environment around them, right? So different, they obviously need to camouflage themselves in the environment, and so different colors are going to be more or less beneficial in different areas of the world. You have antibiotic resistant bacteria, right? So what does this mean? This means that over time bacteria change from one set of genetic material to another, right? So in this case, we're talking about antibiotic resistant bacteria. Have you heard of this term before? Like, do you know what this means, antibiotic resistance?
Like they can't like antibiotics. You can't like take antibiotics basically,
Right.
like medicine.
Right. So previously they used to, so there was an antibiotic called penicillin. So it's like a very famous antibiotic. So I think they invented it like after World War II, or maybe at the end of it or something like that. So when they started using this antibiotic, it started killing off everything, right? So people come in and they give them penicillin, and then that was it. They got cured very quickly, and then and then that was it, right? They're not sick anymore. But over time, they started to notice that sometimes, they would give penicillin and it wouldn't work anymore, right? So the medicine used to work before for that exact species of bacteria, but all of a sudden, the bacteria became resistant to the penicillin. And same thing with many antibiotics. A lot of antibiotics before they used to work, and now they don't work anymore, right? So the antibiotic hasn't changed, right? It's still the same chemical compound, but the bacteria has changed. So what happened is that the bacteria they reproduce very, very quickly, right? One bacteria can quickly turn into thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions. So
Yeah, just like mutation.
right. So each bacteria randomly has a lot of different mutations. What is a mutation? It's like a change in the DNA, right?
Yes.
And so randomly, some small percentage of that bacteria will develop a mutation that allows it to survive the antibiotic. And so the antibiotic might be used and might kill off most of the bacteria, but then some small percentage will survive. And so the next time it reproduces and takes over and causes an infection, this time all the bacteria are resistant, and that antibiotic is no longer going to work, right? So this is a change in the bacteria over time, right?
Okay.
Now this is giving you some examples. One very famous one is called MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, right? So this is one of the worst ones. So this is resistant to like a lot of antibiotics. So to kill this one, MRSA, you have to use like very powerful antibiotics. And sometimes that can be bad because those more powerful ones, they have more side effects and more problems associated with them. In addition, then you just have fewer antibiotics left, So eventually some of those are also becoming resistant as well. Some of those more powerful antibiotics, they also have stopped working. So then people are going to have to go and design new medicines, right? Now this is an interesting example. This is called a peppered moth, right? So naturally, there's different variations, right?
It looks like it got petrified.
Yeah, it looks something like that, right? So this is a very unique and interesting kind of camouflage. It looks petrified because it wants to blend in with kind of natural environments like trees.
Like iron type.
Yeah, it could be iron, could be different kinds of plants, rocks, all different kinds of things, right? So there's two main varieties. One is like a very light colored, right, white with some black dots. The other is the almost completely black. So in the past, you see this white one. It found plenty of areas to hide, right? But what happened was that during the Industrial Revolution, right, factories began to produce all kinds of, smoke and soot from burning coal. And so all of that, all that soot and coal started to, you know, started to,
Pollute.
color the trees in a dark color.
So they couldn't hide it anymore.
So they couldn't
And they're
hide
getting
it.
preyed.
Correct. So they couldn't hide anymore. And so overall, the population shifted away from these light colored moths, and a much higher percentage became these black colored moths. All right. So now they're saying, though, that as the pollution has gone down over time and new trees have grown, then this moth is starting to come back. All right.
Mm.
And then
Team
finally,
trees really helped out, I guess.
yeah. And so finally, this is we already talked about this before, the Galapagos finches, right? So this is the example where all of these have some similarities, but over time they have changed to have slightly different beak sizes, right?
Yeah.
So people have studied this over time and found that when the supply of different kinds of foods changes, then the percentages of the different birds changes over time as well.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, I think they're providing some explanation here, but basically, I think we talked about all this before.
Yeah.
So they're giving one example. So they're saying that, look, in certain dry years, let's suppose there's a dry year where there's kind of a drought, and let's say, some of the easier seeds to eat are in short supply. Well, what happens is that they're going to have to start, trying to find, other kinds of seeds, right? Usually, like a bird is going to usually go for what is easiest to eat, right? What is the easier food supply?
Probably mostly from farms and stuff.
Yeah, right, exactly, right? From farms and things where, human beings have artificially selected for foods that are easy to eat, right?
Yeah.
So, but then when in a dry year, they're gonna have to go and eat, seeds that are, much more difficult to crack open.
Yeah, probably the cactus plant eaters would survive the best.
Cactus plant, yeah, it could be. So I don't know if the cactus plant is here in the Galapagos. I guess it could be. But whatever are these, tougher seeds to eat, what they find is that a higher percentage of the birds become like this one, bird number one, right? You see, this bird has like a very strong beak to crush tough seeds, right? So maybe before a lot of the birds used to look like number two, but then during these dry years when they need, beaks that are, stronger and larger, a higher percentage of the population is going to look like one. All right. So those
I never
birds,
really looked at birds in this way of how big their beaks are. I just think that they're the same type, but one just has a smaller beak.
right.
I never knew they're a different type of species.
Right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Right. So this one over here, probably it's like looking for insects, right? This one, number 4, right? This is obviously not going to crush any kind of large seeds. This is probably going to go poking around into trees and try to find insects behind the bark and stuff like that. You also have shorebirds, right? Like a lot of shorebirds, that live on the coast, they have very long beaks, right? Have you seen birds with really long beaks? Right? So those birds, they're probably they're doing that because in the sand there's a lot of creatures and worms that go down deep into the sand on the beach. And so those birds, they need really long beaks to go and try to find those worms, right? So just studying, the different kinds of beaks that birds have, there's all, many, many different types. And of course, that like eagles, falcons, what do their beaks look like? How are their beaks different from all these?
Their beaks are more longer but firm type.
Right.
Mostly number 2.
Right, kind of like number 2, but you notice, probably think about an eagle. At the end, its beak is very curved like a hook, right?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
It would probably be like easier to like grab onto worms
Not
and
worms,
other insects.
because those are predatory birds, right? They eat other birds. They eat
Yes.
animals. So those hook-like things, that's easy. That's easy for like tearing flesh, like cutting and tearing flesh,
Yeah.
right? So stuff like
Like number one would be like easier to like bake through like plants and stuff, but it'd probably be like their beaks, like from the inside, like their teeth type area, would
mhm.
probably be like really numb instead of sharp.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. So this is for crushing
It's most
seeds. Yeah.
likely gonna be like, numb, like not that sharp because it
hmm
has like a thick shell.
Right. Yeah. So I think you're probably right. Because this one is not really for tearing things, right? This is more for crushing. So
Yeah.
so you're probably correct about that. Whereas like a some kind of a falcon, a hawk, going to be like a sharp beak for tearing and cutting. Right.
Yeah.
All right. So any questions about any of these things?
No, it's really simple.
No symbol? All right.